Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 7th of June, and today we have an action-packed video because there's so much that occurred, particularly in Kherson and Zaporozhye Oblast, so that needs to be discussed. That honestly, I don't think I'm even going to get to all of it today. If I did, then this video would probably be an hour long. So I'm going to do one part of it today and one part tomorrow. The video that I will be doing today is mainly going to focus on events in Kherson and then also talking about some of the events in Novodonetske, which occurred on the night of June 5th, so I won't even be talking about what occurred tonight because that's a whole different can of worms. The entire situation with the Ukrainian attacks towards the Russian positions to the south of Velika Novosilka and towards the city of Tokmak, that's a whole different story. Today we're just going to be talking about the Nova Kakhovka Dam and some of the fighting that occurred in southern Donetsk on the 5th of June. And so let's just begin by talking about something which I found to be pretty interesting, which was the Ukrainian activities on the northern bank of the Dnieper River on the 5th of June, right before the destruction of the Kakhovka hydroelectric dam. And so what we noticed right before that occurred is that there was some very interesting activity that was occurring on the Ukrainian side. So in the days leading up to it, there was actually an increase in Ukrainian shelling, and this shelling in particular targeted the 80th, and the 80th Brigade is over here, the 80th Arctic Motor Rifle Brigade, which is one of the units stationed around the Nova Kakhovka area, but also it has some positions really adjacent to the Dnieper River. It's one of the Russian units that has been tasked with, over the past few months, holding the line around the Dnieper River. And so they were shelled very hard over the past few weeks, and especially on June 5th, that was reported on pretty notably. And there was also reports of Ukrainians utilizing drones, such as the Bayraktars, and they were trying to basically conduct these reconnaissance missions, trying to spot areas that needed to be shelled. And there was firing of mortars, and again, there was some pretty heavy shelling all across the Dnieper River. Additionally, there was pretty significant training and deployment of new units that have been formed. Really, they were formed at the beginning of 2023, and there were several of these units that I actually have mapped on my map, but they're sort of in the corner of the map over here. A lot of these new units, they have not been integrated into the battlefield yet, but some of them have, and I've now begun to move them onto the front line accordingly to where they are stationed. And so a lot of them have been deployed around the Kherson area. Some of them have resources on the Kherson front, and then some of it is also on the Zaporozhye/Southern Donetsk front. So I don't want to confuse people. It's not like every single platoon, every single unit within each brigade is stationed in one specific area. They are spread out across a very wide area. And so just because I have one unit mapped out in a specific city doesn't mean that all the men within that unit are garrisoned in that city. But just as an example of some of the units that have been trained around the Kherson front in recent weeks, you have, for instance, the 22nd Mechanized Brigade. Just one unit. You have over here the 38th Separate Marine Brigade and the 37th Separate Marine Brigade, and these two units have been trained around Mykolaiv. And you could see there's also an airfield around here. There are some pretty good areas for training of new forces, and it is still relatively far away from the front line, while being pretty close if you get on the highway and drive to Kherson. And then there's also, of course, the 21st Mechanized Brigade, which pretty sure I have it stationed around Velika Novosilka in this specific direction. I'll see if I can find it later. That's actually the 31st Separate Mechanized Brigade, but you also have the 21st Separate Mechanized Brigade around here. There's also the 23rd Mechanized Brigade, funnily enough. And so you have many different units that have been popping up. New units, a lot of them with volunteers, conscripts, men that were from other units that got disbanded due to high casualties, and now they're being put together in this hodgepodge and being trained. They have been trained really since the beginning of 2023. And a lot of them have been deployed out to Kherson, but some of them have also been moved to Zaporozhye, where we've been talking about the possibility of a counteroffensive. Now, the logic behind a lot of these Ukrainian moves has been probably to spread out the Russian forces, but it is very, very interesting how a lot of these actions have coincided with the explosion of the Kakhovka Dam, which is something that we will be getting into. But first, I want to talk about what occurred around Novodonetske. And if you recall, in my last video a few days ago, I talked about how the Ukrainians attempted either a probing attack or smaller scale offensive in the direction of Niskuchny and several other towns that are within this salient in southern Donetsk. There's several towns that were targeted in this attack, but the Ukrainians failed to make any sort of notable gains besides taking over a few open fields. And so since that day, the Ukrainians also launched another attack on a different town a bit to the east. And so instead of attacking to the east of to the west of Rivinka, they attacked to the east. And so in this area, it's pretty interesting because the front line is really based around this highway, which connects Velika Novosilka to the town of Pavlivka and by extension to Vuhledar. And we really have not seen much fighting in this area. The Russians, they tried really months ago when the entire situation with the battles of Vuhledar were going on to try to take over towns like Zolota, Niva, and Pershchivka, but that really never materialized into anything because they really didn't have many resources there. So Ukrainians were able to hold their own over there and also deploy their own forces to the area. And so it gave them a very good staging position on the highway. And from there, they have now been able to approach a Russian town that was under their control called Novodonetske, which really hasn't been the scene of much fighting. But you could see that the thing separating the Ukrainian and Russian forces is also a river over here. There is a relatively minor river that runs to the north of Novodonetske, and you can see how it connects into Novomayorske and then just keeps on going south, and it starts at Velika Novosilka. So you have this geographic barrier that is making it difficult for the Ukrainians to cross over and attack the Russians. But nonetheless, the Ukrainians, they in particular utilized the 37th Brigade and 23rd Brigade and 68th Jaeger Brigade. 68th Jaeger Brigade, somewhere around here. Here we go. 68th Jaeger Brigade around Novoukrayinka has been there for a very long time. It was sent in originally to defend Vuhledar, but has never really left. Now it's being utilized for this attack. Also, as I said before, 23rd Brigade was utilized in this attack. And so they crossed over the front line. They also crossed over the river over here, and they penetrated the Russian line and took over the town of Novodonetske around June 5th. But very quickly, the Russians were able to bring in their reinforcements from this general area because the Russians were already on high alert because they had just repelled the attack on Niskuchny and Rivnopil and Novodarivka. And so they had resources in this area, and they were already aware of Ukrainian attempts, either attack or probing, and so they were moving in their resources, and they closed in on the Ukrainian forces that had been able to cross over the river and take over Novodonetske. And so because the Ukrainians were in this sort of precarious position, it was difficult for them to hold on to the town, and very quickly the town changed hands again, and it is now back under Russian control. And so that entire engagement lasted not a long time, maybe like 12 hours, something to that effect. And since then, the Ukrainians have really been centered just to the north of the river. And so I would say this map is not entirely accurate. I would say the better front line would be the river itself, not what I drew beforehand to the north, which is closer to the highway. In reality, the Russians don't really have any resources to the north of the river, but they do still control Novodonetske, which again indicates another Ukrainian failed attempt to take over town in this region. Now, in terms of casualties in this attack, there were some very, very high numbers thrown out by the Russian sources, and specifically the Russian Ministry of Defense, which I just don't believe at all. They said that in the South Donetsk area, which doesn't just include Novodonetsk, it also includes the preceding Russian or Ukrainian attacks in this case on Neskuchny that I talked about in my previous video. But in total, they said that the Ukrainians suffered 1,500 casualties in these engagements, in that they lost 28 tanks, including 8 Leopard tanks, which is just crazy. That's a huge number, and we really haven't seen Leopards engaging Russian forces on the battlefield much. And so any sort of claim like that would require a huge amount of evidence. We'd have to see all the footage to back that up. And so it just seems like the Russians came up with a really random number, which 1,500 is absolutely crazy for a relatively minor attack on 2 different sectors. And so I just can't believe that number, but I am sure that the Ukrainians suffered to some extent casualties, and we do know this because there was a lot of imagery after the fact from Russian sources, which includes drone images showing the destroyed Ukrainian vehicles. I didn't see any Leopards. Maybe that's just because I didn't find them. Maybe the videos are out there. But from what I saw, I did see that there were some other vehicles destroyed, including the French AMX-10 wheel tank destroyers. There's footage that shows that at least 3 of them were destroyed, although I saw conflicting reports from Russian sources that were saying that up to 9 AMX-10s were destroyed. And it's possible because, again, you need these mechanized assaults, and you need to incorporate certain infantry fighting vehicles and tanks in the assault in order for it to work. And so crossing the open fields from, Zolota Niva to Novodonetske, it would require a sizable amount of those vehicles, and in the process you could have Russian forces with their artillery advantage in this area destroying the Ukrainian forces, who were not given a proper amount of support. But it does seem like this attack just to the east of Velika Novosilka does appear to be another probing attack. Maybe I'm wrong, because a lot of people are disputing that and saying that it was an actual attempt at an offensive, but I think what we're seeing now on June 7th looks way more like an actual full-pronged offensive than what we saw 2 days beforehand. It seems like this was just a preparation to see where the Russian lines were the strongest. But anyway, let's move on to the situation with the Kakhovka Dam, which is very interesting, and we don't have all the information yet. I just want to get that out of the way, but let's get into it. So in regards to this dam, a lot of the talk about its destruction began in the early mornings of June 6th, like 2 a.m., 3 a.m. Ukrainian time. And a lot of the locals on Telegram, they were writing about how they were hearing these disturbances in the water, and that they were hearing what sounded like destruction of the structures over here of the building. I didn't really see from what the locals were writing that they heard some sort of massive explosion, that they heard some sort of massive bomb or shell going off. It was more so reports about like the water quality and how it began to overflow and how the structure was being destroyed, not necessarily like loud boom explosions. And I would also add that videos from the ground don't really show any sort of massive explosions or any sort of thing that would indicate that a military would have sent some equipment to destroy it from the ground. So then this really does beg the question, how was the hydroelectric power plant destroyed? We're going to get into that. But from what we're seeing, and I want to give a lot of background into this entire situation, the Kakhovka Dam has been at the center of a lot of fighting really since the beginning of the war. When the Russians were still controlling land to the north of the Dnieper River, the Ukrainians, they did shell the plant pretty heavily, because you can see that there are several bridges that used to be stationed at the lock of the dam that were used to transport a lot of Russian equipment across the Dnieper River. So this was a really vital organ of the Russian entire node in this area. And then, of course, the equipment would be transferred across this bridge over here. And so there was a lot of shelling. A lot of that Ukrainian shelling specifically targeted the southern lock of the entire structure. And at the same time, the Russians, they also targeted the hydroelectric dam when they began the retreat from the northern bank of the Dnieper River. And so when they left for the last time, they detonated the northern part of the bridge, which did cause some damage. Of course, disconnected it from the mainland. And so you had that damage already, and you also had the damage from the Ukrainian shelling. And so even before any of what happened with different water levels started to manifest, we already had this issue with parts of the hydroelectric dam, a lot of key gates and locks being damaged by shelling, which happened really months ago. And so that never got repaired. That was never addressed, because ever since then, the dam has been in a gray zone between the Russians and the Ukrainians. And so it's very hard for the Russians to operate the dam because it's so close to the front lines. And all of the different pumping stations and different operating rooms are on the Russian side of the river. And so they would have control over how those decisions were made about what to bring in. But regardless of that fact, the Ukrainians still have access to a lot of reservoirs to the north of the river, and they had a large amount of water stockpiles. And so for a certain period of time, the Dnieper River actually seemed like its water levels were decreasing, and that it was actually going to get lowered and minimized, so the Ukrainians could potentially try to cross over the river, set up a crossing, and conduct a counteroffensive. That's what it seemed like in the beginning of 2023, as they tried to drain parts of the Dnieper River that they had under their control. But really starting around May, even as far back as April, we began to see a rise in the water levels within the Dnieper River. And so you saw over several months tens of millions of gallons of water being added to the river, which did accumulate over a large period of time and significantly increase the water levels and increase the water pressure in the hydroelectric dam. And the issue with this is that the spill gate and the entire dam itself, its entire infrastructure, was already overrun from the shelling, which certainly weakened part of the structure. But then having this influx, this massive influx of hundreds of millions, not hundreds of millions, but tens of millions of gallons at least, into the dam, into the reservoir, it did hurt the capabilities of the structure, and it did certainly destabilize it. Now, I don't know if this is what eventually caused the entire thing to collapse in on itself, caused the entire spillgate to collapse, and caused the entire facility to collapse in on itself. I don't know that for sure, but just from seeing the videos from ground zero, it does sort of look like that. It is very interesting. I actually show some of the images of that, so I'll link this tweet in the description. But here you can see the extent of the damage from drone footage. You could also see a video here which shows how the water is now flowing and the flooding is beginning. You can see how the building where a lot of the operations for the dam were being conducted, how it's been damaged by this. And it does seem like it's more so caused by the water pressure than by any sort of military interaction. That's just my view on the situation. But in terms of what both sides are saying, you have on one side the Ukrainians that are accusing the Russians of conducting this act of sabotage, perhaps in order to delay any sort of Ukrainian counteroffensive in this direction, and this is their perspective on the matter. Or that they're saying it's a desperate ploy by the Russians to be able to save face and withdraw their men and just extend the war for as long as possible in order to just extend the amount of time that Putin has on his reign. I don't know. That's more of the Ukrainian perspective. And then this is backed up by the Americans, the American intelligence officials. They have accused the Russians of launching this explosion, and they said that the Russians were doing a false flag operation in order to then frame the Ukrainians and blame them for it. So that's American perspective, and they are saying that they're going to unseal documents that are proving this. But again, just remember that it's pretty obvious that the Americans are on one side of this camp. Meanwhile, the Russians, they're accusing the Ukrainians of this, quote, act of terrorism. So, of course, both sides accusing one another. That's what you'd expect. But I'm still skeptical of both narratives till we have more information on what's going on. Now, in terms of the long-term effects of this, I think that the flooding is pretty interesting because it's mainly going to affect Russian parts or areas that are under current Russian control. So here's a very interesting video that was released months ago showing a worst case scenario of what would happen if the dam was flooded and all of the water just began to flow more to the south towards the southern bank of the Dnieper River. So you can see how the low-lying floodplains to the south of the Dnieper River are most affected. There's a lot of very low elevation islands, low elevation cities that are just on the coast, low elevation national park as well. And so a lot of the area over here would and is currently being affected by this significantly, especially on the Russian side. This is the Russian side, and you can see how it's being affected by it. There are many major cities over here that have and will continue to be flooded as a result. And then you have some parts of the Ukrainian side as well that have and will be affected by this flooding. Some of them are less populated than the Russian areas because like a lot of it is just open floodplains, a lot of open fields like this area that I just circled. Nobody really lives there. But then you have some certain urban areas that will be affected, like the southern part of Kherson, which is on very low elevation, Belozerka, which is a suburb of Kherson. This will certainly be affected by the entire situation. Let's actually go to the map and see which towns will be affected on the Ukrainian side. On the Ukrainian side, you have Kherson, as I said before, this town over here, Pridniprovske, Mikilske, and Tokarivka, Lvove, Kozhatske, Berislav will also be affected to a certain extent, which is one of the more significant cities on the Ukrainian side of the river. And then another thing to notice is that there will probably be some increase in the water levels in some of the rivers that are connected to the Dnieper River, such as the Inhulets River over here. And so some of the Ukrainian towns adjacent to the Inhulets River may experience a certain amount of flooding from that. Also over here around Mykolaiv, there may be some increase in some flooding. There is a river over here. It's called the Pivdeny Bu River. I think that just means Southern Bug River. And so that might also be affected because it's connected to the Dnieper River by the Dniprovska Gulf. But again, the main brunt that will be incurred is by the Russian side on cities such as Hola Pristan, Alexei, significant city, which is going to be targeted and has been targeted by the flooding. There's actually satellite imagery of this city if we zoom in. Oleshki, which shows that the vast majority of the town is being submerged at the moment. You can still see the residential areas, you can see some of the houses, but you can see how they're just totally surrounded by water. It's really bad. Any residents that are still there, they need to evacuate immediately, and the efforts to rescue them are not being coordinated at the level needed in order to evacuate everyone at the moment. So a lot of people are still stranded there. They're writing on Telegram that they need help and that, you know, their houses are being flooded. It's really bad. And it's not just Alexei or Oleshki. Of course, you have towns like Nova Kakhovka, which is a huge city in this area. And you have Kakhovka itself. And they're all right next to the Dnieper River. And they are very low elevation. And tens of thousands of people live there. Even after a lot of the war, a lot of people still stayed there. And they are going to be really like ground zero impacted by this. And there's a lot of footage that shows how it's already started to flood and how it's flowing south. Another big issue associated with this is how it will affect Russia's defensive fortifications to the south of the Dnieper River. Here's a very interesting map that I saw, which overlaid a potential model of the flooding which will occur due to the flooding of the Dnieper River and the Russian fortifications that were built after their withdrawal from Kherson. You can see that the main Russian line was, first of all, around the Kinburn Peninsula, just to the east of it, then built around the coast a little bit, then built pretty close to the Dnieper River, but not right adjacent to it, a bit to the south, along some of the highways and along some of the major cities, and then it sort of gets closer to the Dnieper River. and you could see that, first of all, there were a lot of trenches. There were a lot of concrete bunkers and a lot of other fortifications that were dug and that were set up over the past few months. And a lot of that will be submerged due to the flooding. And so this hurts Russia because a lot of what they built has been destroyed. Not all of it, because you can see that to the south, a lot of fortifications along the highways have still been preserved. But they're not as cohesive as the main Russian line that was built. And so this could hurt Russia in a way. But for the moment, the Ukrainians will not be able to pounce upon this weakness because the flooding will cause the river to become so wide that setting up any sort of long-term supply would be extremely difficult for any sort of force that wants to cross over the river and occupy positions to the south. Also, a lot of it's going to become very muddy. There might be issues with like how the water interacts with some of the fields over here. And this is more than just a military catastrophe. This is also a catastrophe for the local population because, again, we know there's a Crimean Canal. Here's the Crimean Canal. It is connected to the Dnieper River, and then it sends fresh water all the way to Crimea. It also provides fresh water for the southern part of Kherson at the moment, for all the people living in Russian-controlled part of Kherson. And we know that for a certain period of time, the Crimean Canal was not connected to Crimea because Ukraine shut it off after Russia annexed Crimea. And so it's not really the end of the world if the flooding really disrupts the supply of the fresh water. But ever since last year, it has significantly improved the supply of water, and it's helped Crimea improve their economy and quality of life. And so now having that cut off again is going to be a huge issue for the local population, because it certainly will affect the amount of fresh water that can be transported to Crimea, because the massive influx of the water from the river is just going to totally overwhelm the canal. And it might actually be drained because a lot of the water is going to begin flowing further north away from Crimea and towards the Dnieper River. There's already footage that I have linked in my map showing this going on. Yeah, here. So the Crimean Canal, the water was flowing towards the Dnieper River. So it's already occurring. And the head of Crimea, he said that there are still large amounts of reserves that they have under their disposal that will be utilized to help maintain the flow of the canal, but that drainage will be a significant issue in the coming weeks, and so they're working to minimize the losses. This is going to be a really big issue for farming in Crimea. It's going to be a huge issue for farming in southern Kherson. They won't have as much access to the water there, and all in all, it's a humanitarian catastrophe. Very hopeful that this doesn't have as wide-ranging consequences as I've said. I'm not even beginning to talk about how the huge influx of water and the total collapse of the dam could lead to issues with the cooling of the nuclear reactors in the Zaporozhye power plants. Although I think we would have seen already issues with the Zaporozhye power plants in the past few days since the explosion of the dam, or since the destruction of the dam, if that were the case, but I haven't really seen any indication of that. But despite that fact, the hydroelectric dam, it also did produce a lot of electricity for the local area. And so again, this is going to further hurt the Ukrainian economy. It's going to further hurt the Russian part of Ukraine. And it will destroy Russian fortifications, which may be interesting in the long term. But I don't know how Ukraine's going to respond now in Kherson specifically. I think that we're going to really begin to move on from this in the next few weeks, and our eyes will be more so focused on Zaporozhye. But just keep in mind all the people that are suffering from the flooding in northern part of Dnieper River and southern part, respectively. So that's all for today. Thank you guys for watching. I'll see you guys later. Bye.